Who Dat Nation, welcome into the catching up on the mock draft edition of the Who Dat Confessional podcast, where we're going to do exactly like that. We're going to talk about Fletcher Mackel's mock. We're going to talk about Saints Wire, PFF, NOLA, go over some of those things and do a quick hitter for you today. Get you ready for some of the names coming up that you'll be seeing a lot of within the next week. So, yeah. Honest Abe, DJ Twigger, Solar Flare, TJ, one of our moderators. Good to see you here, Mr. Consistent. Good to see you. Always good to see you. Lester, Slade, James Garfone, Crass the Fourth. I'm sure Billy Oshie, Mac, Rainey, yeah, everybody else rolling on in. Look at y'all. Who dat to you? Good to see you. We the gods. Good to see you. Let's get it on. Top of the boot. Shout out to our 318 crowd. You do count as Louisiana, no matter what them crazy people down in the 225 and the 504 want to say about you. You count, okay? You matter, 318ers out there. You're real. You might be really part of South Arkansas or maybe East Texas, but you're real, and we appreciate you being here. Who dat to you? Let's go over some of the basics. Number one that I'm sure a lot of people would like to take note of, Mason Smith, LSU defensive tackle. Remember our last episode, we just talked about DTs and what New Orleans is focusing on? Well, here's you another example. Throwing him into the private visit list. So those 30 visits that they can bring in individuals. Well, here you go as a big one. One pun intended. New Orleans take a look at. So it would seem to be pretty shocking at this point to not see a defensive lineman drafted. That it doesn't mean it's guaranteed, because maybe all the guys that they want get drafted somewhere else. We've certainly seen teams snipe players that we know the New Orleans Saints wanted. I remember it happened multiple times to Carolina. Somebody's been in the dome leaking stuff to Carolina back when Peyton was here. But regardless, seems to be that's going to happen. Now, where that happens and when that happens is up for speculation, and that's what we're here for, right? But I think it seems pretty clear that that is going to happen at some point. You're going to see a defensive tackle get drafted. The real question is who ends up being the offensive lineman, if they even go for an offensive lineman. Because I think the thing that you would probably find a little bit of consistency with if you've been following mock drafts is that almost everybody has New Orleans going offensive line. Now, there are exceptions to that, but here is a list of mock drafts from the past week with everybody that they have the New Orleans Saints taking. So, the Ringer had Jared Verse, the defensive end out of Florida State. CBS had multiple people, but every CBS analyst basically said Fashanu, who's a Penn State offensive tackle. There was one that slightly differed by saying Amarius Mims, who I've mentioned in the first round, which Amarius Mims is hit or miss in terms of love-dislike as a 14th overall pick, but it goes past that. Walter Football had Verse in the first round. Chicago Tribune had Byron Murphy II, the defensive tackle out of Texas. Sound familiar? Well, we've talked about it in the last episode. Draft Network had Fashanu. The 33 team, another site that does these, had Fuaga, offensive tackle from Oregon State. Fox Sports, J.C. Latham. Alabama offensive tackle. USA Today, Fashanu. ESPN, Fashanu. Pro Football Focus, Patano. Washington's OT. And then finally, NFL.com had Fuaga. And then having Fuaga with Keon Coleman in the second round in that NFL.com one. I mean, pretty universal that everybody believes New Orleans is taking an offensive tackle in the first round. So that is probably going to be, you know what? I actually hope it's not, right? And I don't have an issue with most of those options. I really don't. I would say that of those, Fuaga and Fashanu are probably the ones at the top for me. That isn't anything against Latham or Mims. I've already said that I like Mims, but I don't know if I love him at 14. You do have to, and the more I've thought about it, the more I've been like, hey, injury history, got to really worry about that. And the fact that he's the least experienced of the group is big. What, he started like 5 games over the past couple years? That's obviously something that you have to worry about. But at the same time, I think the positional choice makes a lot of sense, and I think there's good value long term. We actually talked about this a little bit. But I think that we get so enamored with mock drafts that we lose sight of the possibility of what can be. So I think that it still could end up being something that isn't. And that's why I liked a couple of the mock drafts that listed like a defensive end, because that would be a very Dennis Allen move. Now, everybody here would hate it, right? And not understandably so, but the Ringer taking Jared Verse makes sense, right? I think that that would be a terrible choice based on what they've done historically here, but it makes sense. So I would also like to encourage you who are watching live to throw out things that aren't offensive tackle. And that doesn't mean you have to believe they're going to take it. But what are some names that you would be acceptable or happy with taking in the first round? And feel free to say anybody. I think for me, it's tough to get away from offensive tackle because of what that position means. We'll see what it ends up looking like. Ross picked Troy Fatano in the Locked On Mock, especially for his versatility. Love that you mentioned that, NTR. Sucks that NOLA football didn't cover that. I guess now they're owned by the Advocate. So who can even trust the Times-Picayune? I'm just kidding. Times-Picayune still exists, and it's still a thing. So I would say that the thing that I look forward to the most in the draft is the unknown. And I've talked about this. What I don't think is going to happen is predictability, because I think that you've seen that be different with the man, the myth, the legend that is Dennis Allen. That doesn't mean that you're guaranteed to get a defensive end, which is what he's been very consistently pushing for. I do hope that signing Chase Young changes that strategy a little bit. But I am curious to see if somebody like Latu, edge rusher, somebody like Trop Robinson, another edge rusher, and even beyond that, looking at maybe even wide receiver gets chosen, or a complete curveball with some, a couple of really decent corners in this draft. I think for me, I tend to be where TJ's at, where as long as it's not another project, I'm happy. It's when the projects continue to pop up year after year in the earlier rounds of the draft, I think we have problems. Like if on an island, right, by itself, if Marcus Davenport had happened, it's no big deal. But truly, the style of Marcus Davenport happened year after year, right? Davenport, Peyton Turner, even Isaiah Foskey, even though he's an early second rounder, they're very, very similar in the prototype and needing development, but still being taken relatively early. Isaiah, I'm not really too mad about it. But it's still the same thing on repeat. And you don't need to run to that again. And then you did the same thing with Penning, with a high upside player that you've yet to been able to develop into a contributor. The biggest issue is, do they trust the scouting department to do their job, or are they going to let coaches handpick? I think that's a difference, because I really do feel like there was a time with this team where they trusted the department to do their job and then let them do their job. And even though head coaches always have a say in who you're drafting, I'm not trying to say that isn't the case, nor the general manager. I will say that you can see a theme with a lot of Dennis Allen's influence. And I'm very curious just to see if they break away from that. Because when every mock draft in existence has you basically taking the same person, well, it makes you wonder if that's all you're going to get. Like, if that's simply how it's going to be. And if you're predictable, I'd actually argue that's a negative. All right, Mr. Don says, I'm not ready to call Penning a bust yet, and neither am I. Remember, I always push 3 years minimum. 3 years minimum. But I think that he could develop into something, but you're at a point now where you can't rely on him, right? And I also wanted to throw out the idea of a corner, specifically because you do have Dennis Allen, right? We know that Dennis Allen has had success with corners consistently since he came back, right? I mean, this is a guy who traded for what he had, like 3 different starting corners for 3 different years in terms of opposite Lattimore, and managed to get good seasons out of all of them where none of them were elite. He manages to find those guys and it works well. I just am curious to see, will he take the opportunity to expand on what he's good at, or will he continue to push for what is not working? And what has not been working is developmental defensive linemen and developmental offensive linemen. But at the same time, those are the 2 biggest positions of need for New Orleans. They need defensive linemen. They need an offensive tackle, and arguably on both sides of offensive tackle. Right? Now, back into the chat. Lester says this time last year shows something worth keeping him around. Dennis Allen is a master at finding DBs. Nobody can deny that. I agree, which is also why I'm curious to see what he would think about some of these first and second rounders, because even though I am confident in the corners you have, we know that Lattimore is not the longest term option anymore. He is getting a little bit older. I still think he's got a couple of elite years left in him. You do need help at safety, and you still do technically have a decent sized question mark at nickel and even in that drop down safety. Now, Mac screams Brock Bowers, and that would definitely be a shock, but that would also be, in my opinion, probably my least favorite potential pick in the first round. If the New Orleans Saints select Brock Bowers, I'm probably going to throw a hissy fit on the stream. That would probably be the worst pick that I can imagine them taking of the quote-unquote first-round talents. Now, that's just my opinion. I'm not saying that anybody else is wrong if you differ with that opinion. But that's my opinion. Brock Bowers would be the worst choice they could possibly take in round one. I mean, even the quarterbacks you're not sold on have more potential ability to impact this team long-term than a tight end. That's just my take. Even the best tight ends aren't worth top 15 picks. But again, that's me. Now, there's other positions. There's also running backs, but I don't know if a single running back gets taken in the first round this year. Right? I don't necessarily know if that's going to happen. We'll see. I really don't know if that's going to happen. Now, Justin says trade back in the draft, the late first round, and collect more picks. The thing is, New Orleans doesn't typically do that, and specifically, Mickey doesn't particularly do that. But I would love that, actually. I think that there are enough good offensive linemen to fall back into the early 20s or even the late 20s and still find a guy who could come in and contribute while picking up, some second and third rounders that you desperately need for the years to come. Because I love the Saints, but they have a habit of getting rid of things, and I want them to have picks next year and this year. And this year you've only got a first. Technically, you only have a second because you traded your coach, but you have no third, no fourth, and a bunch of fifths. And even though I have lauded them for their ability to find talent on day 3, and I do believe that's still the truth, you still are more likely to find a consistent winner early on. Now, Tankathon, which is a great place to track how many draft picks your team has New Orleans Saints taking Talise Fuaga, which I actually wouldn't mind at 14, and then Brandon Fisk at 45. So addressing both positions at once. Now, my thing with Fisk is I have nothing against him as a player. It's again how does he fit this team argument? Like, where do you play him? Because that's another guy. And I'm not saying that it's not a possibility because New Orleans has clearly looked at 3-techs. We know they have. We know they've looked at DTs a lot. But he's another Brian Brzee type. Like, he's another natural 3-tech, great shuttle, very short arms. Like, we talk about T-Rex having short arms. This man had like 31-inch arms, like very, very tiny arms. And he's a little bit older. He's already over 24 years old. So, good player in terms of like good collegiate stats. Like, he had 5 years in college, and that's a lot of time. I mean, enough for him to have played over 50 games in college. So that's quite a bit, right? Good interior penetrator, not as good as Brian Brzee coming out. Just, again, repeating what mock drafts have said. But I am hesitant to dedicate to a position that you've already addressed when you have positions of need, unless that truly is BPA. Right? Calvin says, give me Fuaga over Fashanu, Fatanu, and whoever else y'all want to put over there. Look, I won't argue Fuaga or Fashanu, as in, like, I would be okay with either one of them. I don't think that there is a wrong option there. I do like Fuaga. I think there is a lot of value in him. There are a couple of things that I think guys like Fashanu might have an advantage of, length being one of them. But that doesn't mean he's bad. Certainly doesn't mean I wouldn't take him. I think either one of them are a win. Happy. Can be happy with either one of them. And I think who picks before is going to be a big point there because the Raiders also need to rebuild their offensive line. So something that you have to consider there. But in terms of like who I would take, Fuaga, Fashanu, man, I'll be honest, there's not a huge difference between the two. I do like that Fashanu is only 21 years old. Like, he's a young guy, and you know that he's likely to grow in strength, and his athleticism will get better, and he's already pretty good at it. But, I mean, now we're kind of like just debating, who's the best mid-first round offensive lineman. And I think everybody's allowed to have the guy that they like. There's nothing wrong with that at all. I'm not going to gripe at you for it. I would probably slightly lead Fashanu because of long-term potential, but Fuaga probably maybe does a little bit better in the very beginning. I think either are completely legitimate choices. It really just comes down to the style of, do you think that they can fit in what they're trying to build here? Both of them have good explosion scores. Both of them have good, in terms of like size and overall mechanics need work for both of them. But I mean, in a lot of ways, they're very similar. A lot of ways, they both need work. So I'm looking at this going, likely not having any of the quarterbacks. Jaden Daniels going to be gone. Caleb Williams going to be gone. I'm not even a big Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels guy to New Orleans, but Drake May probably gone. I wouldn't want him necessarily anyway. So there are other positions that I look at, and I look at, Terrion Arnold from Alabama. Maybe not a corner that everybody is as obsessed with. I kind of like him. He's a little bit smaller than what you see New Orleans typically take. If you wanted a little bit of a larger corner, there are some out there. He's not necessarily short. He's just kind of wiry. He doesn't have a lot of meat on him. He's not a 200-pound corner like a Marshawn Lattimore. He is like a good $190. I mean, and that 10 pounds of muscle can mean a lot at the NFL level going against big wide receivers, but he's arguably the biggest of the corners. But the corners this year are still very talented. TJ Tampa is another one that you could probably take in the second round if you were looking for a guy just long term. You want to make a good position better, and then you could also look at other guys that defensive line. I still am big on Tavondre Sweat being a second round option for them. Wide receiver Keon Coleman is one that I like. I think a lot of people kind of like him as well. I just think that there's a lot of good options. I just don't want them to get pigeonholed at the position, right? I always want it to be BPA. I harp on that so much. I preach it so much. That's because I truly do believe that it is the best method to find the best team and put together the best team, right? Now, Justin says, I want Leggett. If it's possible, I would love Leggett with pick 45 and OT at 14. Hey, completely legitimate option if that's what you wanted to go. What's your opinion on Jordan Morgan out of Arizona? Good name call out, by the way. I would say second round, I'm okay with. Again, this goes back to what we talked before. I think that a lot of this year's draft class for offensive tackle has good players that have upside, but not many are like ready to go and dominate right now. That's exactly what I see from Morgan. I don't see the same level of explosion from him that you would hope to see from some other guys. And again, that's not to say that he's bad, but I don't think you see the same level. And this was in terms of his RAS measurements as well. For anybody who follows RAS, he also didn't measure as well as guys like Fashanu and Fuaga and everything. But I do think that he has good hand placement, which you always like. Want to make sure that the footwork, the slide is good, and he takes power into his chest pretty well in terms of like controlling leverage. But I wouldn't take him in the first round. I think that, again, there are better guys with better upside. But if you took something crazy in the first round, let's just say LSU fans get their dream and New Orleans takes Brian Thomas Jr., even though I don't really think that he is a high-end first-round split in. I do think that he is talented. Let's just say that happens. Then you can go offensive line, and that was your pick at pick 45. I would not be upset at all, right? Wouldn't be upset at all if that was the case. So there are a lot of good options here. I think it'd be a lot of good options. Calvin says, still would take Sweat at 45. Sorry, but a receiver later, wouldn't mind Peyton Wilson at 45. I think the only problem with a wide receiver later is, and this isn't to be insulting to the very young, very talented receivers that we have here in Olave and Rashid Shaheed. Neither of them have yet to show the ability and the physicality to dominate as a one, as in a guy that you can rely on for certain types of plays. Short slant. I mean, you need a split in. And you're not likely going to find a great one who's ready to go now past round 2. You can, absolutely. New Orleans has done it before. But the likelihood really starts to shrink, right? And I don't think they need an elite one. They don't need an elite one. And I think Olave can be your quote-unquote number one. Like, he can be your primary target, primary route runner. You build more plays around him. But there's still certain things that he's just not the guy. He's just not the guy. He's probably never going to be the physical short yardage guy that you need to catch a 7-yard slant. He's probably not going to be the guy that you want to run as the top piece on the mesh concept where he's the deep crosser going across the field is the first read. You want him as the underneath guy to take advantage of the rub route and then cut underneath to have yak ability. So you have to find a balance there. And I think there is a need at positions that New Orleans just simply doesn't have, right? I don't think they have anybody to do that right now. And until they do, you're kind of left sitting here going, well, a little tricky. And that's kind of what I think when I look at New Orleans, that they still need that position. This is why I like a guy like Keon Coleman. I don't think that Keon Coleman is a stud, but I think that he would fit really well with New Orleans if you picked him in the second round. I think there are other guys that you can make the same argument for. Adonai Mitchell, another example, a guy out of Texas. I think legitimate option to be that guy. Why do I like him so much? He has the ability to attack down the field and crossing patterns. He's really good in the red zone. I'd say he's good in the red zone. I'm not going to say he's elite, but Keon Coleman also good in the red zone. Both of these guys good in the red zone. Both of them have the ability to be the prototypical size guy to fill that role. And if you want a late guy, like you did trade into round 3, you could take a guy like Javon Baker out of UCF. Javon Baker is, in a lot of ways, a Traquan Smith mixed with a Keon Coleman style where he will attack downfield a lot, but he's got the frame and the ability to box out and try to be that bigger wide receiver. He's not necessarily amazing at it. And then somebody in the chat mentioned Leggett, who is closer to being a pure Michael Thomas style, though I would even say Keon Coleman is even closer to Michael Thomas. So it's just about what you're wanting fit-wise. And not even saying that any of these receivers are bad, just that you got to find what fits what New Orleans needs and also what you end up seeing from Clint Kubiak, because I'm also going with a lot of this being the West Coast you've seen from New Orleans for so long. Whereas Clint Kubiak, in terms of the receivers that he's used, he hasn't been using guys who are typically, 6'3", 215 at split end. Now, he has had some bigger wide receivers. If you go look at the roster for the 49ers, you'll find guys who aren't exactly tiny. But are you seeing the same traditional lineup, right? Again, none of this is saying that you're going to run with Olave and try to turn him into some of the things that you've seen them use last year, but just go by all the receivers that they had. Let's just say they're top receivers. So we'll talk about Ayuk. Let's talk about, I'm not going to count Kittle at tight end. We'll talk about Ayuk, Samuels, and Jennings, right? Brandon Ayuk, 6 foot, 200. Deebo Samuel, 6 foot, 215. Juwan Jennings, 6'3", 212, but he was down the list. He's a 7th round pick, right? Not really the bigger physical guys being the primary targets in that split in those short yard situations. They would use guys like Ayuk and even Deebo Samuels in some of those roles. And then obviously George Kittle was a big piece, and New Orleans doesn't have a George Kittle. And you can use Kittle in the same way that you'd use a split in. You don't have that, right? So you've seen Clint Kubiak find ways, and obviously I'm not trying to give him complete credit for Shanahan's offense, but Kubiak, we going by what we know and believe, contributed and helped with that offense. I mean, Shanahan certainly had nothing but good things to say about him. We'll see if it works out for New Orleans. He's also got a history where he was a pretty solid one-year coordinator before getting axed when his head coach got axed, which is pretty normal. You don't usually see head coaches get axed and then offensive coordinators stick around. I know you saw it with Pete Carmichael, but that's not the norm. So you wonder how much of that was out of necessity or how much of that was style, preferring to not have that traditional role in that West Coast and going for a more movement-oriented, which is what New Orleans didn't do at all last year, type of group, which maybe necessitates not going after a Keon Coleman at all. Because Keon Coleman is 6'4", 215. He's not the guy that is a constant motion guy. He's a traditional split in terms of a West Coast offense. That's what he would probably fit best at and play at. He's a guy that runs a 4.6, right? But at the same time, he's very explosive. He's got like a 38-inch vertical. I mean, he can do the big man football at wide receiver. But he's not going to probably do the dominate the 7 through 9 routes. He's going to dominate 1 through 5 and hopefully 6. And that's the style, what you got to have. When I said Olave ain't a true one, they tried to crucify me. It depends on what you define as a true one. Stylistically, in terms of how offenses work, your one is your split in, and the difference is they line up on the line of scrimmage, right? The drawbacks to lining up on the line of scrimmage are you take immediate contact from the opposing corner. The smaller receivers, Flankers and slot guys generally play 1 to 3 yards off the line of scrimmage, allowing them to avoid contact and use quickness to get into their routes and into their breaks. It's simply a different style. Now, there are guys who are smaller who are able to combat that physicality and have success. The most famous one that you're going to remember as a Saints fan, Steve Smith. Steve Smith was a smaller receiver that was a natural number one and split in because he could do it all. Very rare. You could actually make an argument that if Steve Smith had got like 4 inches taller, he might have an argument for one of the best receivers, if not the best receiver in the NFL. If only like he was a smidge taller, because the dude was 5'9". I mean, if he would have been 6'2", 200, and had the wingspan of that, as well as the other things that he had, and I think he's already a Hall of Famer, legitimate argument for best receiver in the NFL ever. And he finished with right under 15,000 yards receiving, over 80 TDs. And that man had to live through some really crappy quarterbacks the first part of his career, and he was comeback player of the year. I mean, Steve Smith, in my opinion, is one of the best, if not the best, receivers the Saints have ever faced on a consistent basis. And I love the fight that he always had in him. But he could be that. Olave could, but he's yet to show that he could be that, right? He's yet to show that. Any chance AD Mitchell is there at 45? There's always a chance, right? Here's how AD Mitchell is there at 45. Look at the wide receivers. Marvin Harrison Jr., in my opinion, is the best one. No offense to Malik Neighbor fans out there. Marvin Harrison Jr. is the best wide receiver in this class. I would love to have Marvin Harrison Jr. I mean, he is everything I want in a receiver. He's big, he's fast, he's strong, he runs every single route. He can do jet sweeps. Doesn't matter what you want to do. In college, Marvin Harrison could do it. Everything. I love that dude. He's my wide receiver one. But you got Malik Neighbors, you got Rome Adazune, then you got Brian Thomas. So you got those 4 guys, and all of them are larger, fast, natural, split-in types. All of them. And then when you get down to AD, he's got the speed that is really impressive. You love his speed. The fact that he's 6'3" and runs a 4.3 is really impressive. He has fantastic explosive scores when he did the Underwear Olympics. He had like a 40-inch vertical. I think it was right under 40-inch. Doesn't have the biggest hands or anything. I think that was one knock I've seen written about it. And yeah, people care about hand size in the NFL. But just absolutely tremendous potential, but doesn't have the same pedigree or has not proven it like other guys have. For example, Marvin Harrison has the pedigree, but he's also had 2 straight 1,000-yard seasons, 2 straight 14 TD seasons, right? He's done it, and he's done it well against top-end talent. AD literally has got his entire career at Texas was 1,400 yards. He had 1 pop-off season, which is fine, but he is not as polished as some of the other guys. We have seen that polished players will a lot of times go early, right? Over guys who might have good potential. Now, after him, you got guys like Troy Franklin, Keon Coleman, who also fit a similar role and could go in that bubble. And it just comes down to what a specific team prefers, right? Do I think that he's available at 45? I would probably pick him earlier than that. Right? I would, but that doesn't mean everybody will. And proven production is something that you see a lot of teams go for. A lot of teams want to see a guy at wide receiver have been a 1,000-yard receiver in college. They want that. They want a guy that's shown that he got 10 TDs in a season in college. That is something that you see teams look for, right? And his running mate, Xavier, even though he's a smaller guy, pretty much a slot player, consistently had more production than AD. Again, it's almost like you look at Texas, and that's really what you want in New Orleans. Like you want the Xavier version, Chris Olave, to be your dominant player, but you need a good player opposite of that to help take the load off. That was AD. So, makes sense. But I do think that he could be available at 45, just like Keon Coleman could be. And it really just depends on what you're looking for. I would say that you make a definite argument that AD fits, based on what you saw in San Francisco, maybe he fits Clint Kubiak better because he is more of an explosive move-around guy than a traditional split-in. Sean Payton would probably take Keon Coleman. And he'd probably take him in the second round, just like he did Michael Thomas. We'll see how that plays out. Just as you did, the Saints will actually switch up their prototypical edge rusher and go for more speed into containing running quarterbacks and get quicker pass rush instead of getting coverage sacks like they have been. I would say the acquisition of Chase Young says no. Well, yes and no. I mean, not like Chase Young had a bad RAS, right? I mean, Chase Young's relative athletic score was good. Or is good. Like, he is a good athlete, right? We know that Chase Young is a good athlete. He didn't do the combine and everything, but you've seen him on the tape. You know, he's got the athletic profile to be good, but he doesn't have all the tools put together. But I don't think New Orleans leaves it. And specifically, I don't think Dennis Allen leaves it. How do I know that? Well, I look at what Dennis Allen's been drafting. I don't think he's leaving. I think he's going to stick with what he likes. I think he's going to stick to what he likes. And I don't know if that's a flaw. For me, I just hope it doesn't happen in the first or second round. Find you a nice little third rounder you trade up for if you're going to do that. You see them drafting a safety, I think it's very possible. I think New Orleans needs safety. Doesn't mean I am not a fan of JH. At the same time, I say the same thing on the opposite side of the ball. I am not going to rely on a guy who did really good in select snaps last year to be my starter. Want to have competition there. Want to have competition. So we'll see how that plays out. I do think that safety is, I would say that is probably the one thing that I wish I'd see Saints blogs and stuff talk about more. I'm surprised it doesn't get brought up because I feel like safety is a big need. I feel like safety is a big need. Now, I did see a good local hometown guy get mentioned in the chat, so I want to mention, I didn't want to have the longest podcast tonight, but Calvin bringing up Edgerrin Cooper. I like him. He's from Louisiana, so I always want to support guys from the boot. I think that he'll be a good starter one day. I think he's probably a good backup year one. I love his motor. I think that he plays with insane intensity. I really don't know where he would play in New Orleans. Because New Orleans basically plays nickel. They've already got their guys. Unless you think he's the long-term option. I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't take him in the second round. I love his athletic scores. He's got good speed. His 10-yard split, which is more important, was really, really good. I enjoyed watching him at Texas A&M. But he's somebody that I'm just not sure if New Orleans needs. Could we trade up for a quarterback? Could. I don't think they will, but they absolutely could. But yeah, I don't think they would. I just don't have any quarterback I'm in love with to want to do that. So maybe that's my fault for not even being able to foresee it because I don't even want them to do that. But here, y'all, I wanted to keep this one shorter today because as we're getting closer to the draft, I want to prep y'all with a lot of names, but also I don't want to keep keeping y'all for an hour when y'all have Thursday night. Sadly, my Pelicans have embarrassed me again, and I have fallen for the trap. Pelicans off season, get it together. Get it together, Pelicans. Get it together. That is all I'm going to say about the Pels. As far as I'm concerned, appreciate you, Willie Green. I think you've done a good job helping build this team. Time to move on. Time to move on. But we'll talk about that and more on the next Who Dat Confessional podcast. Who Dat, God bless. Appreciate you. Love all of you. Thank you for being who you are. We'll see how the Pelicans do against the Kings. But at this point, maybe I'm being too negative. I'm so out on Willie Green. I just don't trust him as a closing coach. I just don't. But we'll see how that goes. We'll see. I don't even know how much hope people have, but we'll see. I'm definitely going to be watching the game, though. Who Dat? God bless. Love every single one of you. I'm out.